Welcome back to the next segment of our discussion with Sam Gindin. Sam's recently retired as assistant to the president of the Canadian Auto Workers Union and is now a professor of political science at York University in Toronto. Thanks, Sam. So the basic argument we're hearing and the logic of the bailout that's coming from Congress and Obama is that more or less the union is to blame for this crisis because these companies are saddled with these payments, and because the union's to blame, the union should take the workers should take the hit. What about this logic, and what's the rationale?
Well, you should appreciate how the extent of the state's intervention on this, because it's quite remarkable. Given how this wasn't an issue at all in dealing with Wall Street, what people were making, not just at the top, but at various levels, it was a non-issue. And then in the auto industry, it's really not the compensation of management hasn't been an issue. And it's interesting how much they focused on the workers. And what they actually did here, which is so remarkable, is they said that these unionized workers have to match. They didn't just say go in and bargain something. They said they have to match the conditions of Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. They actually named the company in terms of wages, benefits, and working conditions. And again, that, as I mentioned last time, that the health care plan they have, instead of being properly funded, has to be funded through stock from
It's kind of ironic because the same people who are saying we don't want the government telling companies how to run the auto business, they don't have any trouble telling the unions how to run their business.
In the most rigid kind of a way. And it's very ironic because one of the things workers are waiting for from Obama is that Obama would actually make it easier to organize workers in the United States, where it's harder to organize workers than anywhere else. And
this is this new piece of the Employee Free Choice Act, which is going to be a big fight over this piece of legislation.
Right, which is going to be a big fight over. And so at the same time, workers are expecting a change there. The state is basically using the auto workers to set the standard by saying to the auto workers, you're going to have to match non-union plans, which is really saying something to everybody else.
What about the argument that the auto workers have had it pretty good for a long time, and they've been amongst the elite of the workers, and they had a health care plan and severance and layoff protection to some extent that nobody else had, and that's made this sector uncompetitive.
Yeah. Let me get to some of the numbers on wages and stuff. But I mean, anybody who looks at this problem seriously knows that the problem here has to do with the kind of models that are being put out. You don't have models that are selling. You don't have models that are sensitive to how things are changing in the economy and the environment. You're going to die. So anybody looking at this seriously knows that's where the problem is. If that doesn't get changed, nothing gets changed. Blaming the workers for it, a few things. I mean, one is that auto workers have been doing relatively better historically than other workers. That used to be something everybody was proud of. This was an example of America at its best. You could actually win things and share in productivity. The problem is that nobody else was making these gains. Everybody else was being hammered. And the truth of it is that over the last 25 years, auto workers haven't been doing that remarkably. In terms of wages, their real wages since 1979 have gone up by 8% over that whole period. If they went up as fast as GM, as the salaries of GM executives, they'd be making $280 an hour, not $28 an hour, and probably saying, I don't mind taking a little bit of a cut. They've actually lost work time over that period. There was a moment in the late 70s when workers were starting to move towards shorter work time. They gave that up. Their healthcare costs have gone up enormously, and they add that up when they look at their costs. But the reality is it's not because they're negotiating improved benefits. It's because the cost of healthcare in the States have been exploding for drugs and all kinds of health services, way beyond what's happening in any other country. And the solution for that isn't about workers taking cuts and giving up their health care. It's actually about talking about a national health care plan. And these numbers about workers getting $70 an hour, it's just ludicrous because what they're doing is they're taking all the costs of all the surviving spouses and retirees, these 480,000, that number 480,000, there's 6 times as many as those working. And they're adding them to the existing workers who are, they're just dividing them amongst those workers. So it's important for workers to fight back around these things because it's the only way for workers to change the agenda and put other things on the agenda. And I think this should also be understood in 2 other ways. One is that you've got everybody talking about the need for stimulus, that there's a new Keynesianism in the land. And then you've got corporations trying to survive by laying off people and cutting wages. Now, there's a problem in this logic. And one of the things that workers have to actually, and I think the union has been very inept at doing this, is actually to say, wait a second, what is the logic here? You're spending all this time talking about stimulus packages, and then you're undermining them by saying that you want to cut the income of people.
Yeah, it's almost considered unpatriotic not to take the wage cut.
Yeah.
Like as if it's bad for the economy for
whereas,
you to have high wages.
Whereas reality, by their very logic today, they haven't been saying this forever, but today what everybody is saying is the only way you're going to get out of this depression is through some kind of stimulus. And these wage cuts, are going to, the point about them is that they set a standard for others. What happens in auto still matters. I don't mean it's definitive, but it still matters. It sets a tone. So you're undermining even that logic. And I think the union hasn't been very good at exposing even that contradiction.
And why? Why isn't the union better at all of this? Or is it partly because a lot of the leaders of the union have been okay with more or less the status quo for the last 50 years or more?
Well, I mean, let me just make one other point about the concessions that are so important, because it's not like somebody invented this argument that, hey, why don't you just give up something and keep your jobs? Or the government's lending them money, why don't you do your share? Workers have been going through this since '79. I mean, you have to remember that the auto industry, the Detroit Three, had 750,000 workers in 1979 when the question of concessions came up. And every round of bargaining since then, the union slowly made more and more concessions until now they've almost lost their health care, they lost their work time, and the workforce went from 750,000 to under 200,000. More than 2/3 of the jobs are gone. You've got to say to yourself, well, there's something larger happening here. And part of the question is, well, why hasn't the union moved off of that? And that's a difficult question. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One is there's been a general defeat of the labor movement and progressive forces over, since the early 80s.
Are we talking both countries now?
Both countries.
The numbers you were just giving were U.S. or Canadian numbers?
They were U.S. In Canada, they're not quite as dramatic, but the same trend. And the Canadians used that to fight concessions for a long time. They really tried to show that this doesn't work. And in fact, we did better when we resisted it, because we got larger questions on the agenda. But to the question of, well, what's going on here? I mean, part of this goes beyond the union. There's been a defeat of the labor movement generally. There's been the defeat of progressive forces. So people in labor feel more isolated. They feel weaker. Their expectations have been lowered. So there's that general problem, and that's outside labor unions. I think in addition to that, there are labor leaders who begin to get comfortable with the argument that there's nothing that you can do, that globalization, neoliberalism, it's too complicated. Because it is difficult. They're right about it being difficult, but if you actually said we can do something, then you have to change all your structures. You have to have a more democratic, more accountable union. You're mobilizing people who are going to be demanding and saying things. And I think some trade union leaders, unfortunately, began to get comfortable with saying, geez, there's nothing we can do. We're just kind of trying to hold the fort. And a lot of them, I think, do think in this narrow way of there isn't. They've internalized that. There isn't much.
One of the chapters in your article is hypocrisy in class. What do you mean?
I mean that when you take a look at how, first of all, you have to remember this was a loan. And on Wall Street, they were just dropping it from planes. They were just giving it to them. And they were giving it to them forever. And Wall Street, the $700 billion, it was about 20 times what the Detroit Three were asking. And no questions. So the question is, well, what's going on there? Now, at one level, that's not really hypocritical. That kind of reflects the difference between the Detroit Three and finance. That the Detroit Three don't have that kind of iconic status they used to have as the American way. Mass production, mass consumption.
What's good for the America.
Right, mass consumption, mass production, the power of the auto to change suburbia, just change everything about our lives culturally.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about what is the whole importance of the manufacturing sector in the United States, and what is this whole issue of wages and the crisis? And is higher wages a solution or the problem? Yeah. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Sam Gindin.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington is a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the powers in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.